alone. Now your grace is always with me, and I'll never be alone. Me always see it. Good morning, everyone. How are we doing today? Feeling good? All right, day of Pentecost. Today we're going to be actually in Acts chapter 1 and 2. If you have a Bible and want to open up there, you can follow along a little bit later. We're going to have some verses on the screen as we go, though. I don't know if you read the paper or not. It's probably a terrible way to start your morning. Too many depressing stories in the news that make you wonder where the world is headed. I've got Monday's paper here. The headline from this past week: Islamic State takes Ramadi. Ukrainian city topples into lawlessness. And my favorite was this: FBI did hacker control commercial plane in mid-flight. This was a wonderful little story about a hacker taking control of the engines through the in-flight entertainment system. I hope none of you are getting on a plane this week. It seems like these days the news is always negative. Now, I say these days as if it was different in the past, but these headlines are in reality not much different than what has been in the past. I mean, does it really matter if you're talking about Al-Qaeda or the Taliban or ISIS? It seems like it's always the same. It seems like someone is always fighting about something somewhere. And sectarian divisions and violence are not a new thing. They've always been with us, and they're not going away. And it's not just religion, of course, that causes us problems. There's this story of the Ukrainian city toppling into lawlessness. In Donetsk, what's happened is these pro-Russian separatists are using their so-called rebellion to do all kinds of horrible things, to rape, to pillage, to kill, to settle old scores. And so political and ethnic divisions as well cause us to divide. We also, of course, had that wonderful story last week about Waco. Remember the biker gangs all meeting in one restaurant and then using the parking lot as their own private shooting gallery. But when we look at these headlines, they lead us to think perhaps that the world is getting worse. But the reality is that evil has been with us for a very long time, and each generation has had its own kind of share of wars and brutality and inhumanity. We just get to see it more now, up close and vivid and personal because of modern technology. And at times it appears that the world seems to be coming apart at the seams. One might even think that the Maker did not know what he was doing. That the world seems to be in need of a massive product recall. Or if I can switch metaphors, one might talk about a reboot of the system. But there's something so fundamentally flawed here at the very core that we might need more than simply a reboot. Like some virus-infected computer that needs to be wiped clean and to begin again. Sometimes it's as if we're watching the world falling apart, crumbling before our very eyes. Are we so foolish as to hope that it could get better? Now, these feelings, I think, are not too dissimilar from the Jews of Jesus' day, what they might have felt. You might remember that for them, the glory days of David and Solomon were long since in the past, and they had a lot happen in their history that was very depressing. And so the tribes of northern Israel actually in 721 had been conquered and taken away, never to be seen again, even to this day. In 586, southern Israel, what we call Judah, experienced her own dark days when she was taken into captivity in Babylon. And it was there in Babylon that many of the Jews began to wonder and to question, even to question God. But even after they returned to their own homeland, about 50 years later, they were under a succession of foreign powers. First, the Persians, and then the Greeks, and now in Jesus' day, they're under the control of the Romans. But these same prophets who had foretold that God would punish Israel and Judah through the Assyrians and the Babylonians, in their prophecies, they also had words of hope. They also predicted that God would later, after these days, He would restore Israel. And He would make a new kind of world. Look, for example, at Isaiah chapter 2, verses 2 through 4. I think we had that on the screen. It shall come to pass in the latter days that the mountain of the house of the Lord shall be established as the highest of the mountains, and shall be lifted up above the hills, and all the nations shall flow to it. And many people shall come and say, Come, let us go up on the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that He may teach us His ways, and that we may walk in His paths. For out of Zion shall go the law, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. And He shall judge between the nations, and shall decide disputes for many peoples, and they shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. See, the prophets are brimming over with promises just like this, of better days, of a restored Israel, of no more war and no more violence. That is why there was so much excitement in the days of Jesus among His disciples. They thought that He might be the one to bring these promises to reality. Even after His crucifixion and resurrection, we still see signs of their hope in Acts chapter 1. Look at verse 6. Just before His ascension, He meets with His disciples one final time, and they ask, Lord, will You at this time restore the kingdom to Israel? They're wondering, are the promises of God spoken by the prophets about to finally come true? Will the world truly change? Instead of answering their question, Jesus gives them a mission. Look at verse 8. But you will receive power when the Holy Spirit has come upon you, and you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem and in all Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the earth. And the story that follows this in Acts, of course, is both familiar and fascinating. It's the story that we call the day of Pentecost. Just a bit of background here as we think about this. Pentecost is known by the Jews as the Feast of Weeks, or the Festival of Weeks. It's one of three great pilgrimage festivals in their religious calendar. And in Jesus' day, people would come from all over Israel, and even from the diaspora, the countries around them, to celebrate in Jerusalem. And the normal population of Jerusalem would go from about 80,000 to, some estimates are 200,000, 300,000, as high as 500,000 people in Jerusalem to celebrate this feast. Now, originally it's an agricultural festival. It's to celebrate the harvest coming in. But later, and we're not exactly sure when this happened, it came to be the time which they would celebrate the giving of the law on Mount Sinai. And if you ask a modern-day Jew, when they think of the Festival of Pentecost, what they would think of, it would be the giving of the law, as recorded in Exodus 19. You see, they think of God coming down to Mount Sinai with lightning and thunder, a thick cloud and a blast of trumpet. They think of smoke and fire which envelop the mountain. They think of God Himself coming down to claim them as His own. Now today, Christians across the globe, of course, are celebrating this particular day as the Festival of Pentecost, the day on which the church was born. But to think of it simply in those terms, I think, is to miss something of far greater significance. See, even the word church is confusing in our culture today. If you ask the average person on the street what they think of when they hear the word church, I think one of the most first things that's going to pop into their minds, of course, is a building. Right? For some people it's a large building, for some it's small, some it has a steeple, others it doesn't. But it's a place where you go and you gather with others to do religious things. You sing songs, you say prayers, and of course you have to hear the obligatory sermon. It's a place where people dress up in their Sunday best. And for others, especially I think the young people, it's viewed as a place of exclusion, a place to be judged, a place sometimes simply to be bored. But none of that matches what Luke wants us to see here in Acts chapter 2. Now the story is familiar on the surface. Just to review, the disciples are all gathered in one place. Probably here we should think of the 120 that Luke had mentioned in Acts 1 that were gathered in the upper room. And then the fireworks begin. The sound of a rushing wind. And then what appears to be tongues of fire separating out on each of them. And then before you know what's going on, the disciples are speaking in these tongues. Here in chapter 2, it appears that this means foreign languages, although later on it will be something more than this. But the disturbance causes a crowd to gather. And Peter takes advantage of this, of course, by speaking the first sermon, Christian sermon, about the death and resurrection of Jesus. He's doing what Jesus had actually commanded them to do. He is witnessing. He's telling people what he knows about Jesus. And of course, Peter receives this fantastic response that any preacher would be envious of. 3,000 people. Look at verse 41. So those who received his word were baptized, and there were added that day about 3,000 souls. Wow. Now, it says they were added. But added to what? A new community? Is this something new and different? Actually, not exactly in Luke's mind. In Luke's mind, this is the restored community, the restored Israel. For Luke, this community, which we call church, is the restored Israel spoken of by the prophets. And this story that we see here in Acts chapter 2 is far more than simply the birth of an institution. It's the Old Testament prophecies coming to life. It's God beginning to reshape the world. It's the end times now. And Luke includes several obvious elements to help us see this, to recognize the restored Israel here. So, for example, if you look back in chapter 1, we skipped over this scene. But in chapter 1, Peter leads the disciples in choosing a replacement for Judas. Now, have you ever wondered why they needed to do that? I mean, after all, this isn't a regular practice. It's not like after each of the apostles dies, they're going to replace them. It's only on this one occasion that they do that. It's a one-time event to get the number back to 12. And it needed to be 12 for the same reason that Jesus chose 12. Because 12 represents the tribes of Israel. And the same thing is true, the same reason is here for why Luke mentions that there were about 120 people. Notice he says about, not that there are. Could have been 113, could have been 127, but he says there's about 120. Why does he use the number 120? Because that's a multiple of 12, and we're supposed to see here the gathered tribes of Israel once again. And then, of course, there's this specific text that Peter himself cites from Joel. And he says that this prophecy of Joel is happening now in their midst. Look at verse 16. But this is what was uttered through the prophet Joel. And in the last days it shall be, God declares, that I will pour out my spirit on all flesh, and your sons and your daughters shall prophesy, and your young men shall see visions, and your old men shall dream dreams. Even on my male servants and female servants in those days I will pour out my spirit, and they shall prophesy. Now, what happened on the day of Pentecost is not exactly what the Jews thought was going to happen. It didn't fulfill the prophecies in the way that they thought, but it was part of the plan of God. It was a plan spoken of by the prophets, a plan to reclaim a broken world and a shattered people. And so this morning, I would like us to dig just a little bit deeper into God's vision for the church. What He sees when He looks at the church, when He thinks of the church, what He planned for the church. And I think we have a strong clue in Ephesians chapter 3. Look at verses 8 through 10. This is Paul speaking to the Ephesians. To me, though I am the very least of all the saints, this grace was given to preach to the Gentiles the unsearchable riches of Christ, and to bring to light for everyone what is the plan of the mystery, hidden for ages in God who created all things. Don't miss this part. So that through the church, the manifold wisdom of God might now be made known to the rulers and authorities in the heavenly places. For Paul, it is through the church that the manifold wisdom of God is made known. It's the church where the mystery that has been for so long hidden is finally revealed. But what is this mystery? What is it that Paul speaks of? In the context of Ephesians, it is that both Jew and Gentile are both part of the people of God. That a divided humanity is now brought back together once again. But look specifically at the language. It's very interesting the way he describes this. Paul envisions a heavenly audience. Notice the rulers and authorities in the heavenly realms. This heavenly audience has been looking down on creation for so long, and they're wondering. And they're wondering what we ourselves perhaps sometimes wonder. What was God thinking? How did things turn out so bad? I mean, go back to the story in Genesis. It all started out so well. After each new act of creation, God looks at what He made and He says, it's good. It's great. Humans, the high point of His creation then, however, begin to sin. And they're kicked out of the garden. Then Cain kills Abel. And a spiral of violence ensues. And that leads to chapter 6, in which the world is so broken that it must be wiped out and washed clean. But the post-flood world of Genesis is not much better than what came before. Humans, in their presumption, seek to attain the status of gods by building this tower to the heavens. And so God confuses their languages and causes them to scatter, furthering and deepening the divide among us. And anyone looking at such a spectacle, think of this heavenly audience again, anyone looking down at this couldn't help thinking that the Creator had somehow gotten it wrong. Wondering, what was the plan here? Thinking perhaps that the world was coming apart at the seams, crumbling before their very eyes. But Paul says that now the church makes all things clear, revealing what God had in mind all along. But how? How does the church do that? Because in the church, Paul describes a divided humanity is brought back together. Jew and Gentile are now one. In the church, all the differences are overcome. And it's that same vision that Luke has in chapter 2 of Acts. Look back at chapter 2 again. Notice this curious phenomenon of the speaking in tongues. Why is it here? People from a variety of nations have come for the feast from all over the diaspora. And each of them now hears the message spoken in their own language. Tongues, at this occasion, at least this one time, for symbolic reasons, is used to cross cultural barriers and reverse the curse of Babel. So that now everybody can hear the message of God. But there's more. Look specifically at the end of chapter 2, verse 43 and following. And awe came upon every soul, and many wonders and signs were being done through the apostles. And all who believed were together, and they had all things in common. And they were selling their possessions and belongings, and distributing the proceeds to all as any had need. And day by day, attending the temple together and breaking bread in their homes, they received their food with glad and generous hearts, praising God and having favor with all the people. And the Lord added to their number day by day those who were being saved. Here in chapter 2 we see, if only for a brief time, the ideal church, God's vision. A group of people that are bound together through their commitment to Christ. And they're living out the teachings of Jesus. Remember, throughout the Gospels, He had talked about selling your possessions and giving to the poor. And now we see these early Christians doing exactly that. Taking care of the needs among them. Holding all things in common. They are a true community. not looking out for their own interests, but for the needs of others. They're spending time together in large groups in the temple courts and in smaller gatherings from house to house. And they're eating together and they're fellowshipping. It's a place of harmony and peace. They have truly become the people of God, the restored Israel, empowered by the Spirit within, not by this external law. It's what Ezekiel had said in chapter 11. And I will give them one heart, a new spirit I will put within them. I will remove the heart of stone from their flesh and give them a heart of flesh, that they may walk in my statutes and keep my rules and obey them, and they shall be my people and I will be their God. You see, the day of Pentecost is much more than the birthday of the church. In Luke's mind, it's an eschatological event. It is one in which the world is given a foretaste of things to come. The church is meant to be a signpost of the future. It's meant to show the world what's truly possible. What we as humans were always meant to be. Humans from all different backgrounds coming together, overcoming our petty and individual differences to be one true people. It is God's showpiece where His manifold wisdom is revealed to all. It is meant to be this aha moment for the world where people can look at the church and they can think about it and they can see, and then they can say, now I get it. Now, throughout the centuries, the church has influenced the world in positive directions. In the early Roman Empire, the church actually, as it began to grow and influence things, was able to do away with infanticide, for example. It raised and increased charitable contributions. It did a lot of good. And throughout the centuries, of course, Christians have been behind the founding and support of numerous hospitals and universities and charities. Christians were key leaders in the abolition of slavery, in women's rights and human rights in general. And even today, of course, Christians do a lot of good things. Churches have recovery programs and benevolence programs. But unfortunately, there are the other stories we could tell of how the church has failed in its mission. Even in Acts, the ideal community only lasts to chapter 4 and things start falling apart again and the pettiness begins to creep back in. For the church is only a signpost. It's not the final destination. As Christians, we continue to live in this tension between the already and the not yet. The kingdom of God has come, but not in its fullness. I often ask my students in class, when we're talking about the history of the church, I say, describe for me your ideal church. If you were designing it, if it was up to you, what would it look like? And they say things like, well, it would be loving, and it would be accepting, and it wouldn't be judgmental. It would be a place of healing. It would be a place where people don't play games, where they don't wear masks. It's a place where no matter what you've done, you can find a place. A place where you are called to be better than you are, but you're forgiven when you're not. A place of belonging and love and support. That's the Church of Acts 2. It's the revealed vision of God's plan that we as Christians continue to strive for. I began this morning talking about the depressing stories in the news, stories that cause us to think that perhaps the world is coming apart at the seams. But there are other stories. Stories throughout the ages of people, of churches willing to sacrifice themselves for the sake of others, of people going out of their way to help, of people loving and serving and giving. And all of these stories are glimpses of God and what He has in mind. They're signposts of the future. My prayer this morning, as we close, is that the church can be at that kind of church that points others in the right direction, that gives them hope, that serves truly as a signpost of what God has in store. Let us continue worship.